Hello and welcome back to our final lecture on our third unit, the Imperialism unit. Last time we took a look at the Spanish-American War. We saw how it concluded after only a mere 4 months and how America's empire was born. At the conclusion, we gained control over the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico. We will be protectorates over Cuba. We'll talk about all that today because this is really when the problems begin. We just came off a very successful war, but the fact is it's going to take money and manpower and blood to protect and control this empire. Something that we like to pride ourselves on is during our revolution, the fight against tyranny, we did not like being a colony of the British Empire, but yet after 120 odd years, that is what we have become. That is what we are now, is that an empire. We have kind of lost that initial moral compass, and now it is a lot about money, it is a lot about resources, but it also parallels kind of what's happening in the day, and frankly, it's a trade-off, because America will become more powerful, America will become wealthier, but we just have to ask at what real cost. So, enough of my soapbox, we'll go ahead and jump into it. So, let's take a look at our new territories. Again, the political cartoons, I love them from this era. They're very telling. So you have here Uncle Sam with McKinley, President McKinley as his waiter. Uncle Sam trying to decide what to order, right? And we've just had this war. Basically, he got one of all. So anyways, how are we going to manage these new territories? Let's find out. I'm going to break this up into we're going to talk about most of these, the big ones first. Puerto Rico, which of course today is still a territory of the United States. But in the initial days, and actually let me back up to last lecture. We talked about how there were some that did not support imperialism in the United States. They were known as anti-imperialists. And they had a lot of concerns about how the United States was abandoning kind of its morality and how the Constitution really didn't allow for things like colonies. Well, that was basically specified in what became known as the Foraker Act. This specifically denied U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans. There was no question. They would not be American citizens, okay? So this would allow the President of the United States to directly pick the governor and even part of its legislature. Now, this would be challenged because this puts Puerto Rico in a really weird spot, right? They are citizens, but yet, of what nation? Just Puerto Rico, because that belongs to the U.S., but yet they're not Americans. It's a very kind of in limbo situation in terms of citizenship status. This got challenged in a series of cases that collectively are known as the Insular cases of 1901. And the Supreme Court basically sides with the law, saying that the Constitution does not automatically apply to people in newly acquired territories. Now, after all this was said and done, eventually in 1917, it's in the middle of World War I, the U.S., and frankly, World War I's the reason that this happens, the U.S. does grant Puerto Rico citizenship. And the reason I point out World War I is because by becoming citizens, that then allows them to fight in the armed forces. So, welcome to the United States. Here's a rifle. The second country up for discussion is Cuba. Now, Cuba would have a unique status within our new empire. They would become a protectorate. A protectorate is a country whose affairs are partially controlled by a stronger power, so kind of like what we saw with Puerto Rico there. In 1903, they passed an amendment called the Platt Amendment, which said that the U.S. could intervene in Cuba's government to, quote, preserve independence. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, frankly, it's very broad for a reason, right? We wanted the ability to go in there and protect economic interests whenever necessary and use military force if necessary. You can see there that it does help make it economically stable to the point where a lot of Americans are looking to invest in Cuba. You can see the investments over a 15-year period quadruple in size to $220 million. Makes sense. It's only 90 miles away from Florida. You can grow sugar there. A lot of positive reasons to invest in Cuba. So next up, we got the Philippines. So as I mentioned, the Philippines were the largest of the Spanish colonies that the United States took over after the Spanish-American War. We also discussed how at the end of that theater of war, how the Filipinos were a little bit angry that the Spanish had basically surrendered to the Americans, and they realized that perhaps there's not going to be, we weren't necessarily fighting to free them. They were a little bit taken back by that. And so what ends up happening, and I think this is probably the most important part of the unit, what ends up happening is that we kind of become the baddies. We replace the Spanish as colonial rulers here, and the Filipinos begin attacking us in much the same way that they had been fighting against the Spanish. And shockingly, how do we respond? We actually set up designated zones for the Filipinos to that they have to live in, and basically these concentration camps that they are forced in. I mean, I hope alarm bells are going off in your mind right now. This is what got the whole thing started between Spain and Cuba, and now all of a sudden we're doing the exact same thing to keep this colony as a part of our empire. I mean, it's the exact same thing within a year. So it's shocking to me that we could just completely miss that point at the time. But it goes to show the main problem with empire is that people don't like being ruled over, and especially when it's a foreign nation like this. So, we ran into a lot of problems with the Philippines, and we would end up being there for the next 3 years fighting a war, the Philippine-American War. About 20,000 Filipinos died in this, and about 4,000 Americans died. So, to put that in perspective, and then the cost, you can see the cost there, $400 million. So to put this in perspective, not only was the cost 20 times more than what we had actually paid for the Philippines, okay, but the death count was basically the same. Well, no, when you factor in the fact that, about 5,000 of those that died in the Spanish-American War were actually due to disease, only about 400 actually died because of battle. What that means here is you have another 10 times the amount that are dying to protect this new colony. This is what the anti-imperialists feared. They feared that it would cost too much money, that it would cost too much blood, and they got exactly what they were afraid of in the Philippines. Now, after they were able to put down the rebellion and a lot of the guerrilla fighting did slow down, there were some positive trends that were put in place. William Howard Taft, who will later on go on to become president after Roosevelt, Taft would serve as the governor of the islands, and for the most part, he did some positive things. Brought in a lot of young Americans to go teach in the Philippines, and you can see there the effect it had on their education. 1898, you had about 5,000 kids in elementary school. By 1920, you had over 1 million. So, to institute those kind of changes, that's a positive trend. But again, does it make up for the fact that 4,000 Americans gave their life so we could dominate this country, and then to turn around and within 40 years give it back to them? I don't know. It's a tough pill to swallow, I think. So, and I will point out that, with the independence, 1946, that's a year after World War II. The age of empire is coming to an end, at least that form of empire. And so, the whole, it's really for naught. I mean, the whole thing seemed to be a folly. All right, so one of the final sections here, we're going to look at how our new foreign policy changed, how the foreign policy of the United States changed after we began to form an empire. And, a lot changed once we started to have these areas that we had to control. But, in particular, our policy centered around the idea that, number one, we have to continue growing our economy. And the only way we're going to grow richer is by exporting goods. So, basically it becomes all about protecting that shipping, just like Mahan had talked about earlier. And we also said that the U.S. military would intervene in order to keep those markets open. And there's the key right there, that the U.S. military would be used just to keep markets open. This is going to lead to a number of wars that are going to be fought for, frankly, what you might consider to be silly things. including bananas. How about that? We'll talk about that in a second. The third kind of pillar of this new American foreign policy centered around the fact that closing off an area like China to American products would threaten our survival. We have to be able to trade in order for our economy to thrive. Mention China. Between 1895 and 1900, exports to China had increased 4 times, while Europeans, controlled more of those spheres of influence that we had seen. We had to do something in China because America was losing out. Even though China had not been carved up the same way that Africa had, in some ways it had, at least economically. We didn't have that foothold like many European countries did. And so we suggested a new policy for how to trade with China and try to get the European nations on board with it. We called it the open door policy. And, here America's kind of turning more towards the free market capitalism we talked about earlier. But in the open door policy, this was the policy proposed by the United States to European nations that said we can all trade with China. There's enough of them that we have, there's plenty of market available. So basically this would, benefit the United States because it kept our ability to trade open with China. And, it kept the European nations kind of calm. So, again, we're less than 20 years out from World War I, where all of these European nations are just going to, the pressure is building. So anytime we can reach an agreement on trade, that's a positive thing. So the United States is now a major player on the global stage. And this man was a big part of that. Teddy Roosevelt, we mentioned him as a war hero from the Spanish-American War. He became president in 1901. You have the assassination of William McKinley, the president that we talked about, elected in 1896 and then 1900. Teddy Roosevelt was vice president under McKinley. McKinley was shot by a man who walked up to the president, not nearly the security, of course, as you have today. The man had his hand bandaged, if memory serves me correctly, walked up to the president and basically had a gun concealed in those bandages and pulled the trigger. McKinley would die shortly after, and Teddy Roosevelt found himself as the new president of the United States with basically a full term left. The election had been in 1900. McKinley had just been inaugurated for the second time in 1901. And so what that meant was Teddy Roosevelt had 3 years left in that first term, and we've already seen him multiple times, and so hopefully by now you're getting a sense of what he was like. But even though we've often described him kind of as rough and tumble, there were a lot of positive things that Roosevelt did. We mentioned the conservation movement in our last unit. In 1904, he helps end a major global conflict, and one that will have, we'll see this conflict again, but the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. The Japanese by the way, this is a very interesting time for them. They are starting to industrialize. They are starting to become much more modern, and we're going to talk about them again in World War I. Anyways, we're seeing kind of the modern Japan start to rise up here. But they were in a brutal land war with the Russians, and in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt was able to negotiate an end to that conflict and ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and rightfully so, for helping end that war. But he was not afraid to show strength when it mattered, and he would basically take our Navy kind of on a tour, on a worldwide tour. And our Navy took on the nickname with, of course, our newest vessels, our newest boats. Our Navy continued to get stronger. Remember, he had been the Secretary of the Navy before resigning to join the Spanish-American War. Anyways, he would send our Navy these brand new steel-hulled ships that, as they coming into port, way off on the horizon, they glimmered as if they were pure white. Okay, they became known as the Great White Fleet, and Teddy Roosevelt took 16 of those ships on a world tour, and they basically stopped. You can see the map there, all those different locations. And I think this served a couple purposes. Number one, to show off. Okay, but number two, to let people know we can get to you, right? And so especially when we're looking at visits over to Asian nations. This was perhaps even a warning, like, we can get to you if we want. We have this. We are a powerful nation. Remember, America, this is a brand new role for America to become a powerful nation like this militarily. We'd never seen that before. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is beginning what's called gunboat diplomacy, okay? Implying or threatening war if terms aren't met between nations. So, this feeds into one of his most famous quotes, which said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Meaning that, basically, if a nation, it's kind of the Machiavellian, it's better that they fear us more than anything. So if you do not agree, we will have to take up force if we cannot reach an agreement. Speak softly, carry a big stick. So, if you're walking down the street and there's a guy holding a baseball bat, you're probably not going to go up and rob him and take his wallet, right? So, same thing with nations. If you show off your strength, nobody's going to mess with you, and that's kind of what Teddy Roosevelt pushed. Later on, in fact, we would see this more with Taft, but it's kind of during the same era that we're going to see dollar diplomacy, in which we have the government kind of backing up. Remember, we've turned around completely from where we were in the first unit, the second unit, where, it was very laissez-faire, it was very hands-off, the government wasn't getting involved in any of this. And it is the exact opposite now. You have what's called dollar diplomacy, which said that the U.S. would back up, basically guarantee loans made to foreign countries by American businesses. So, what we're saying here is that the U.S. is backing up American businesses, which makes foreign countries want to do more business with them. Okay, so you have the backing up here of the U.S. government with all their might, and what we're going to see is the great expansion of U.S. corporate interests throughout the world. Now, another thing that Roosevelt was known for was what's called jingoism, and the definition, as you can see, nationalism in the form of aggressive foreign policy to safeguard its own interests. And I like the three flags here because a lot of times these terms sometimes get used synonymously, and that's not exactly right. So patriotism, love of and devotion to one's country. Okay, nothing wrong with patriotism. There's nothing wrong at all. It's good to be patriotic. The Olympics, right? A very patriotic event. That's good stuff. Nationalism. We're taking it a little too far when we get to nationalist, and this has become much more present in the last few years in America. This idea of America first and basically only America, where really we've really affected a lot of our alliances internationally. Because of this very nationalistic foreign policy. But you can see nationalism, devotion to the interests or culture of one's own nation. So whatever's good for us, it doesn't matter what happens with anybody else. Jingoism, which comes into play with what we're talking about. The extreme nationalism, characterized especially by belligerent foreign policy, chauvinistic patriotism. Basically, going out and, some people accuse Teddy Roosevelt of, kind of that fear-mongering, taking those gunboats to these foreign countries to, intimidate them unnecessarily. Okay, it's not necessarily the best diplomacy when you're, holding a weapon at the same time. So, I have, again, a couple of pictures up there, and President Trump, whether you love him or hate him, he is definitely, one of his messages has been about this, more nationalistic fervor, and so, especially early on in his administration, when we were dealing with nations like Iran and North Korea, even for some time, there was that concern, like, are we going too far? Is this going to start, an unnecessary war? And thankfully, we avoided that, and credit where credit is due. So, it's something that pops up from time to time. We just have to be careful, because America is not the only nation in the world, and in particular, we need to have friends out there. We need to have alliances. So, when we just focus on what's best for us, sometimes those self-interests, do destroy alliances, which are so important. We're going to see that so much so in the next unit in World War I. From 1898 to 1934, we're going to engage in a series of wars in Latin America that become known simply as the Banana Wars. I mentioned earlier that one of the pillars of this new foreign policy is that American markets had to remain open, that if you cut us out, then that is a threat to us, okay? And we will be willing to use our military in order to stop that. So what's going to happen in Latin America is not only do you have a series of, just a lot of political instability where there's a question of America, and if they're going to be allowed to trade. But you have basically these very poor nations in Latin America that America is going to be increasingly involved in for various reasons. And we're going to take a look at a couple here. The beginning of this, though, before we get into the wars themselves, this all goes back to James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States, and he basically issued a warning to European powers, saying to keep out of the West, okay, that Europe is not going to colonize the Western Hemisphere like it had colonized other areas, that frankly, if there was a problem, the U.S. would try to take care of it, but Europe needs to stay out. Now, we can argue whether that was actually effective. I mean, whether Europe actually had any interest in that. But, frankly, there wasn't much anything that the U.S. could do at that time to defend that doctrine. But, thankfully, it was not pushed by many of those European nations. Teddy Roosevelt added on to this. A corollary means an addition, okay? So Roosevelt corollary on top of the Monroe Doctrine. He said that any kind of disorder, chaos, political instability in Latin America might force the United States to become an international police power. All right, so if you have a rebellion, a revolution in a country that overthrows a leader that, frankly, we don't like, and he's threatening to close the borders to us, close the markets off, the U.S., according to Roosevelt in this corollary, the U.S. could get involved, okay, could force, that country to whatever. I mean, force out the leader, we would do that. I mean, that has happened time and time again. Let's talk about a couple different examples here. Panama is a good example of this, where you have a small stretch of land in Panama, where at the narrowest part, it's about 10 miles across from Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. Great place for a canal, and like I brought up earlier, the French had tried it. I think 15 years or something they had tried to build a canal. It's very, very dangerous work. A lot of the French were dying because of disease and because of accidents and all that. So anyways, they basically abandoned the project, and the United States came in, and I mean, not only through some political maneuvering, because Panama wasn't even independent at the time. It belonged to Colombia, which is the nation to the east. And basically, we kind of told the Panamanians that we would support them in their push for independence. And as a result, when they did, of course, Colombia is not going to mess with us. When they did, they gave us control of those 10 miles. Right? So that's a great example of gunboat diplomacy. Like, hey, Panama, you should be independent. And Colombia, do you have anything to say about it? While we have all our battleships parked outside. The Panama Canal, I do want to just take a moment to recognize how much of an amazing engineering feat this was. There's a lot of negative in this unit, but there's definitely some positive. I mean, this is one of the most amazing structures ever built by man. And like you can see there in the statistics, you had early on 22,000 ended up dying trying to create this. About 200 were dying per month due to disease. We took control of it in 1904, began working on it, and you had another 5,000 that would die before its completion in 1914, the first year of World War I. But man, it revolutionized not only trade, but it allowed us to also get our ships, to other remote parts of the world much quicker, right? If you have the Navy based out of New York City and all of a sudden San Francisco is being attacked, before you would have to go all the way around South America, but now you can just cut through Panama, and it literally takes off, I don't even know, 3/4 of the journey. I mean, it's an amazing feat. Cost about $9 billion in today's money. Quite expensive bill there, but definitely was worth it. The U.S. would control it until 1977, when we signed a peace treaty with Panama and basically gave them control of the canal back. We still have access to it. It is still open to use. People, you have to pay fees, but the U.S. did hand over control of that to Panama, as we're trying to kind of in some ways kind of make up for some of these other areas. Mexico. We have a fraught history with Mexico. Not only, of course, did we take about a third of their land in the 1840s, but you fast forward to 1910, and you have some more problems going on. In particular, there was some violence coming from Mexico, and some border towns were being hit with violence and just bad things going on. The United States would get involved. We would actually invade Mexico in 1910 to hunt down one of the rebel leaders that was leading these assaults into the United States, Pancho Villa. You might be familiar with that name. So again, we're still under the banner of the Banana Wars here, but one example of how the U.S. is getting involved in Latin America, and not saying right or wrong here. I mean, definitely if there are Americans being attacked, that needs to be stopped immediately. So, but we're becoming increasingly involved in Latin America as the years go by. The next two examples, not very good examples of, or at least not positive examples, I should say. Excellent examples of the Banana Wars and the kind of violence and military action that they inspired. But Haiti has an interesting history. We would actually occupy it for about 20 years. Under President Wilson, we went in. There was a revolution happening in Haiti. It had been a Republican government, at least at one point. They were overturned. We began to change the laws, just like what we had done in Hawaii, which allowed for non-Haitians to own land. And as you can imagine, Americans did begin to gobble some of that up. But we occupied that country for 20 years with our military. Honduras. Okay, Honduras, a very, very poor nation, but very profitable banana industry. And this is where we get the name for the Banana Wars. Between 1903 and 1925, America would invade Honduras 7 different times to try and keep that country, the government, stable, and basically in order to keep the banana trade active. All right, so we invaded 7 times during this period to basically make sure that bananas could continue to be bought and sold in the United States. There were 2 major corporations that were inviting U.S. action. The United Fruit Company, which is today known as Chiquita, and then the Standard Fruit Company, which today is known as Dole. Those companies basically, in some cases, just simply bribed senators and representatives to get the military used in these areas, and it worked. They went in, and of course, those fruit companies have a lot to gain if the military comes in and squashes any kind of chaos, because it allows those markets to open back up. And you might be saying, well, that's not a bad thing. And it's not. That's not a bad thing. But when the U.S. military, again, the anti-imperialists were afraid of this, that the U.S. military would have to be used over and over and over in order to keep these markets open. And this has just never been the role of America. And again, I think the founding fathers would probably be rolling over in their graves had they known all this. In 1933, we're at the beginning of the Great Depression. FDR is president. We decided to kind of change the policy in ending a lot of that military interventionism, even though we would invade a lot later on, especially in the Cold War with the rise of communism in that region. But FDR did say, we'll continue trading with you, but we're not going to invade you anymore. That does sound like a good neighbor. 1945, everything changes. World War II ends, the Cold War begins, and especially when you have nations that have leaders overthrown by communist regimes, or sometimes even elected communists that we decided to go in and overthrow. Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua. There's a coup we attempted to overthrow in 1961 in Cuba. We tried to assassinate Castro a dozen times. So anyways, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the Cold War unit, but this would continue to be something that involved the United States military, and later on, the CIA, things like that. So, anyways, it's, there's some good and bad mixed in there, but ultimately, the United States arrives at this moment. We now have an empire. We now have a strong navy. We have a strong military. America's a major power now, and the rest of the world may not realize that quite yet, but they're about to, because our next unit is World War I, and we're going to see America stand by idly for the first 3 years of that conflict, but then emerge as a powerful force that really sways the whole movement of that war for the Entente side. All right, guys, thank you for tuning in again, and please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks.